What is going on, everybody, and welcome to a bit of an update and exhibition of this new function calling capability, as well as like some of these other API updates, but mostly things are just faster and cheaper now. But the big thing here is function calling, and I think this is going to be a massive change in programming just in general, but also the kind of intersection of programming and AI and adding sort of intelligence to your programming. So what I want to do is just show some quick examples of kind of how I've played with it so far, as well as kind of run through their example. I don't think that their documentation is good enough, but I think it leaves a little bit to be desired, I suppose. In thinking about what are all the things that we really can do with this, because this is unbelievably powerful. So anyways, with that, let me pull up my example. And in this case, I'm just importing OpenAI. We will use, I thought, JSON at some point down here. But anyway, we'll get to that point. And then this notebook I'll put up on GitHub, so there will be a link in the description. So really, I just kind of want to quickly run through these examples. You don't have to follow along or anything like that. Just know, hey, this is like a possibility now. And this is thundering and lightning outside, apparently. This is really cool. Ominous, is it? Anyway, so here we go. So historically, if you wanted to do something like this, like for example, if you had a user and that was just chatting with GPT-4, they might ask, hey, what's the weather like in Boston? And if you just sent that to the API via the usual chat completion, you'd get a response like this. I'm an AI language model. I can't provide real-time information, blah, 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 right? And it even suggests where you could find that, which is useful, but it doesn't actually answer the question. But we as programmers, we could totally have a function on our end that does pull weather data. But to do that, you would need deterministic information like what's the location, and also did they actually want the weather data for that location, right? So in this case, imagine you have, and this is the example that OpenAI used, and this is like the only one, which is kind of a bummer because, like I said, this is so powerful that I think we're going to see some crazy stuff coming from this capability. But for now, this is the example. So imagine this is your function, and somehow you're getting the weather data based on some location. In this case, it's really doing nothing. It's just kind of returning the weather info for some location. But you could imagine you have a function that gets the weather information based on some location. And this is something that GPT-4 just can't do for you yet because it's not connected to the internet. It can't pull data, it can't scrape data, but you can as a programmer. So imagine you've got this function, and if the user wants weather data, you need the location that they requested. And so you want to be able to pull that sort of structured data from GPT-4. And historically, while this has been possible with like pre-prompts and kind of making these sort of like forms, it's been clunky. You've had to do a lot of R&D to figure out which one works best and all that kind of stuff. Whereas here, it just works, and you can kind of force it to work, as opposed to historically, like with some of the projects I've been working on, sometimes it doesn't work, and it's hard, if not impossible, to like force it to work. So anyways, to get this to work, now what we have here is a new kind of completion where first thing to note is we have a new model. This is GPT-4 0613, which is like the version number, I suppose. So you will need to use that. I forget when exactly the old GPT or the current GPT-4 gets deprecated, but you do need this for now. Eventually you won't need this little end piece. But anyways, so here we still pass the exact same thing that we did before. Like up to this point, everything's the same, just a slightly different model version. But then we add this new thing, which is functions. And in here, this is where you describe the function that you may or may not use based on a user's input. And this, one thing to note, does get passed to GPT-4. It will suck up your context. So if you you could have as many functions. Note this is plural, so you could have a lot of functions. So like right now this is just one function, but you could have tons of them that are possible. So you can already imagine like an actual Jarvis like home assistant. You could do all kinds of stuff. You could dim your lights. You could get the weather. You could play music. You could play a video. You could order something on Amazon, right? You could do anything, right? You could have functions for all those things, and you could automatically detect and determine and extract what exactly it is the user wants. So anyways, here you just describe the function that you may or may not use. So in this case, it's get current weather. That's the name of the function. For all of this, again, it goes into the context. And this version of GPT-4 has been trained to handle this type of input and context. So it's going to be exceptionally good at this kind of structure, but the more effort you put into making this be as descriptive and useful as possible, noting that this is part of the context, I think you will achieve better and better results. So we name it Get Current Weather, and that is also just happens to be the name of the function. It wouldn't have to be, but if GPT-4 in this case does detect that this is the function that should be used given a user's input, it would be convenient, I think, if the names do match equally. Then it will be very easy for you to understand, oh, we want to run this function. But you don't really have, the function doesn't even need to actually exist. And this is an important thing. There doesn't have to be a function. And I'll show an example at the end of there isn't any function, but we're using this functionality to do cool stuff. Now, so anyway, we describe the function. Again, this is up to you to come up with a good description that will help GPT-4 to determine, are we trying to run a function or is this some other piece of input? Because alongside, playing music and all these other things, you could also just ask the agent, how are you doing today? We don't need to run a function for that. We're just going to answer that. So anyways, we describe the entire function, and then we start defining these parameters. And what this new function calling, which I think is not really an appropriate name, but whatever, all it's doing is attempting to generate the parameters that you will pass to the function that you're describing here. So again, it's hard to kind of wrap your mind around that, or at least it was for me, to be like, oh, this is all we're doing. We're just extracting structured data, period. And so now we've got this function. Now we're going to define all of the parameters that are in here. And basically it's going to be in here. In this case, we have one parameter, and that is location. So we just need to know where is this person asking for the weather. And then this just further defines that location. And here you can start to severely restrict the possibilities of a location, for example. And then here, finally, you can say it is required that we have a location, but you could imagine in the future that there might be some parameters that may be passed, but not necessarily required. So it's cool that we can even do that. Finally, we get to function call auto. There are three options here. You have function call auto. This means GPT-4 will kind of automatically determine whether or not you actually want to run, this function and get output that is the parameters to this function. Or you can pass none, and that will essentially force it to not use any of your functions. Do not, so if the user just says, hey, what's going on, or whatever, don't try to pass it through a function. And then you finally can pass a very specific, you can pass like name equals and the exact function that you 100% do want it to run. And this, again, is extremely powerful because in the past, even if you supplied a form and you told it to fill out this form and you tried to force it to do what you wanted it to do, sometimes it just wouldn't, or it would change the form, or it would change the formatting of the form, and then you'd have to parse it or figure out how to parse it. It was so annoying. Whereas this just forces it to happen. I hit some keys. I don't think I changed anything, but anyway. So this is how you build the new completion. And this is just JSON. So this is just how to describe a JSON object, basically. So you can pass anything you want in here. So we'll come to that. That fits the JSON description. Anyways, continue on. So I just described all that. So then, if we are to run this, notice that I did function call auto. So we're letting it determine if this function should be run. In this case, it does determine that the function should be run. It's a function call finish reason. And then we come down here, the message, this is where you would normally get content. But in this case, there is no content. Part of me wishes that you could tell GPT-4 to also produce that content. I understand we're saving tokens by not doing that. But if anyone from OpenAI is watching, which I doubt, it would be nice to be able to say, hey, populate content. Or if there is a way, someone let me know in the comments down below, because you will oftentimes still want the agent to respond in some way besides this. But anyways, nonetheless, we carry on. And you still could, because you could still pass a query yet again and then just say function none, right? And get the response. It would just cost you one more query and one more wait for that query. Anyway, continue on, the function call does run. We get the argument for location in Boston, and then it tells us the name of the function. In this case, we just have the one, so it's obvious which function it was. But you could imagine you could have hundreds of functions. Well, probably not hundreds because you'd probably blow context, but you could have a lot. You could have tens probably, dozens. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So we get, okay, the location Boston, then theoretically you pass that through to your function that grabs weather for Boston, for example. Obviously, this is hard to read or hard to use, so at least in my tinkering, this is how I converted it. There might be better ways to do it, but essentially, you can use this. This right here is still it's like an OpenAI JSON object, but it's like a specific to OpenAI, so it's their own custom JSON object apparently. But it does have an attribute that or a method that we can convert to dict, and then we're just grabbing that function call and then argument, which is like literally function call arguments. Then from here, we're loading it via the JSON module, and then we can print it out and then print location. So in this case, we're printing funcs, so it's just location Boston, but then if we really wanted to grab that location, Boston, now we're ready to do whatever the heck we want to do with it. So not only can we extract information from a user's input, so in this case, everything that GPT-4 needed to populate this, so all the structured data that we wanted GPT-4 to extract was contained in that user's input, but it doesn't have to be. So one of the examples I've shown here is the previous video I did was term GPT, and the idea was, hey, we use GPT-4 all the time to produce Python code or commands that we might run in the terminal. What if we just automated that whole process? So I'm using a relatively decently long pre-prompt because I need to do, in that case, I do a one-shot learning example and then basically have it fill out, the rest on its own. But then I have to parse that, and sometimes it doesn't follow what I told it to follow. Especially if you're using GPT 3.5, which, by the way, you can use all of this that I'm showing right now. I'm using GPT-4, but you can also do it through GPT 3.5, which is huge because that's way cheaper, faster, everything. And again, the reason I was not using GPT 3.5 was because it did not follow my instructions as well as GPT-4. But now, I haven't tried with GPT 3.5, but this should work just way better. I expect that it will. I bet we can do term GPT with 3.5 now. I'll probably end up updating it to do that. But this also completely changes. Basically, it nullifies all of the code up to this point for term GPT because this replaces it entirely. So imagine you have a prompt that says, well, this is my function call. So I guess I'll describe that first. But this is the prompt. It's like, how do I install TensorFlow for my GPU? So in this case, I want to get all of the commands to do that, and then theoretically we could run them through the terminal. But what I really want to extract here is all the terminal commands. Now, if we just let GPT-4 answer this, it will provide a bunch of text, and then it will provide those commands, but then we'd still have to extract them. And it's possible to do this just by seeking out probably like the tilde bash and then tilde in this case. But I would get less wrapped up in doing that and like, oh, well, you could do that without doing this. But really, what instead I'm trying to show is not only can you extract structured data from a user's input, we can use GPT-4 to respond with extremely perfectly deterministic structured data. So this is just an example of that. So someone asks, how do I install TensorFlow on my GPU? So, okay, fine. So the message that we pass is literally that prompt. And then here, I just described it up above, but I'll just describe it down here as well. The function we're calling is get commands. This function doesn't even exist. It doesn't exist. But then I describe this function as get a list of bash commands on an Ubuntu machine. And in fact, I almost probably would change that. Yeah, so I changed it up here, I think, but I forgot to change it down there. But get a list of bash commands to run on an Ubuntu machine. Something like that might even make more sense. But again, this is what I mean by this is going to be used in the context. So the better you describe this and kind of formulate this, the better your responses are likely to be. But anyways, running it this way, we then say the parameters, type object, commands, the type of, so it's the commands is the parameter name. The type, in this case, is an array. And guess what? An array can be of any length. So here, maybe we're expecting 2 commands. Maybe we're expecting 12 commands. Doesn't matter because this is an array. So then the type, what's going to be contained in that array, it's going to be a bunch of strings. and then the description of each little type is a terminal command string. And then the description of commands is a list of terminal commands that are a list of terminal command strings to be executed. Again, this is all like my first run through, and then I attempted to kind of fix it here purely because I was kind of wording this in terms of what I wanted to be extracted. But really, the way that you want to think about this is as if you have a function, even if you don't have a function, as if you had a function. You're describing how that function works. And then here you're describing what is that parameter. And in this case, it's as if I'm still trying to tell GPT-4, hey, I want you to get a list. I think that this will work, as you will see in a moment. But I think you can prompt it better by envisioning it as you are describing the function that will be passed through. Because this is how the model's been trained. So you want to keep this in mind as you're creating this stuff if you want to have the best results. Now, in this case, just as an example, function call is auto. So I left it as auto. Now, if we run this, you can see that the reply content has nothing to do with a function call at all. Instead, it just tells me to install TensorFlow. You'd normally follow these steps, blah, 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 right? That's not what we want. This is not structured in any way for us. So that's what happens when you do auto. But instead, we can set it, the function call, to say name, and then we want to actually run get commands. So this instructs and informs GPT-4, kind of hints and nudges that no. Don't respond to me as like an agent. Respond to me with this function parameters. and doing that, changing nothing else, it indeed responds in that way. And again, as I go through this, I think I could have probably written this description better to describe the function itself, not what I wanted GPT-4 to do. Describe the function itself, because again, that's not really what it was trained to do. But nonetheless, despite my failings, it does respond in the correct way. It is a function call. It determines that, okay, these are the arguments. This is for function get commands. And then now we can go ahead and format it in this way. And now you can see here, this is that exact list of commands. So again, not only was this, getting structured data from an unstructured response, that what would otherwise have been an unstructured response, we're like eliciting these exact commands. And in fact, if I go back up here, I never even really took a deep look at this. I don't know. Yeah, there are some like bash, but even here you can see this one didn't even use like that bash moniker. So again, you're going to be looking for, these cases of double or triple tilde, but sometimes it says bash, sometimes it will say Python, all that. It'd be you couldn't rely on that. It was so tedious. Whereas now you can rely, I can't quite say it's like going to be 100% accurate, but I think that at least, again, I didn't even do this right, and I still got exactly what I wanted. So it's pretty cool. So so I can't, as I wrote here, and I still just it just puts a big old smile on my face, because this is so powerful that I can't wait to see what people do with this, because this is just so completely open-ended, because you can do like anything, and you can properly tie in AI into otherwise deterministic programs, which before now, that has been very hard and very finicky and tough, very tough to do. Whereas now it's like, no, it's totally possible now. So one more example that I want to show before I'll wrap it up. This is already longer than I expected this to be. Imagine you have the following. So this might be another way that you would elicit different types of things through like a form or something like that. So imagine you've got user input. The input could be whatever it wants, but then you want to have various personalities to your AI. Maybe you've got a nice one, a mean one, a sarcastic one, whatever. This could be as much as you want. So in this case, what I've said is I just asked a simple question: is it safe to drink water from a dehumidifier? And then we just pass it as normal. Again, make sure, of course, you're using that latest 0613 GPT-4. And then again, this function doesn't exist. I have, in this case especially, I've known it, like in this one, the get commands, this function would eventually be written, because you would need to, os.system or whatever, the commands that it comes up with. In this case, You still would probably have a function because you're going to pick which personality, but it doesn't have to exist. But get varied personality responses. So the description of this function, correctly written, is it ingests the various personality responses. The parameters that we accept. We have a sassy and sarcastic, and then a happy and helpful. But you could put as many as you wanted in here, if, whatever you can think of. Talks like a pirate, whatever. And again, so string. The description of this string is a sassy and sarcastic version of the response to a user's query. A happy and helpful version of the response to a user's query. So you can already see where I'm going here. And then required is both of them. But again, we could pass different variations of all of them. Also, some of them wouldn't necessarily be required. So when applicable, you could have a sassy and sarcastic response, and then when it just really doesn't make any sense, you wouldn't need that, or something like that. So then again, we are going to force the function call, and then here we get, what's pretty hard to read, but then we can kind of split those apart, and then we can get the sassy and sarcastic version. Oh, sure, if you fancy a little microbial cocktail, go right ahead, but seriously, don't. Yes, that's exactly what I was after, a sassy and sarcastic response. Very good. And then the happy and helpful, I'm sorry, I don't know if that's really good for happy and helpful, but it's not recommended to drink water from a blah, blah, blah. While it's extracting water from air, dehumidifiers don't filter or clean water, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you can see here that, okay, we just extracted two different variations of a response. Again, this is like, 0.000% of what can be done with this sort of capability. But really what I wanted to drive home is it's not just extracting information from a user's input. It's just creating structured data, whether it's from a user's input or from what otherwise would have been the output from GPT-4. It's really cool. And I did not see this coming, certainly not this fast. And this has been a thing everyone's been doing. It's such an obvious thing to create. I can't believe that they actually further train the model to do this very specific thing. And I'm just kind of blown away. I didn't see this coming. I don't think that they hinted that they were even doing this. So, yeah, it's just really cool. So anyway, that's all for now. Like I said, I'll put a link in the description to this exact notebook, but as you can see, you can probably come up with your own, but getting the kind of structure down and just kind of starting to work with this stuff and kind of getting used to, because like I said, my first attempt was the term GPT thing where I already made the mistake. I'm not trying to tell GPT-4, hey, produce me this list. I'm actually it already knows that it needs to do the thing based on that description of that function. So anyway, just little stuff like that. It's going to take a little bit to get used to this paradigm, but it's just so cool. It's so cool. So anyways, if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, whatever, you know the deal. Feel free to leave them below. Also, if you have ideas or things that you think that can be done here that are a little more than what I've already brought up, feel free to leave those below, because like I said, I think there's going to be a lot of, I hate to use the word hacky stuff, but that's kind of what I mean, but not in a bad way. I think there's going to be really cool applications. And like I said, this is something that I would have expected to come from an open source model. I'm very surprised that they've added this functionality to GPT-4. So yeah, cool. See you guys in another video.